Okay, welcome to the webinar, Preventing Revenue Plan Failure. I'm your host, Eric Bodek. We have two great guests here today, Eric Swenson from HubSpot and Jeff Serlin from Revcast. Just a few little housekeeping items as we kick stuff off. At any point, you can ask questions. We have dedicated question time at the end, but I'll also try to work in any questions that come up during the webinar into the conversation. So feel free to send those questions over at any point. But we will have a Q&A session at the end too. We are recording this webinar. We will be sending out a copy of the recording within the next few days after the webinar is done. So you can look out for that in your email. And we will have, when you log out, there'll be a quick survey. By survey, I mean one question that you'll have to answer about the webinar, or we'd like you to answer at least about the webinar. So if you don't mind, it's just one question. We'd appreciate the feedback. With that, I'm going to kick things off by having Eric Swenson introduce himself. Eric, would you kick us off?
Yeah, happy to do so. And Eric, thanks for having me. Excited to be here with some fellow planning nerds, talking some very exciting topics near and dear to my heart. A little bit of background on myself. I'm coming up on 6 years at HubSpot. The vast majority of that time has been sales ops and sales strategy, leading that team here with the last 2 years specifically focused on leading what I would call our connected planning function, which is really sales, marketing, and CS, and managing that intersection. Prior to HubSpot, I'd been at companies big and small, big being like EMC Dell, did some time at a company called Carbon Black, which was IPO'd and acquired by VMware, and also time at a kind of a true startup called Actifio, about 5 years there. So that's my background, and excited to share some of the painful scars on my back today. Hopefully I can share some of those lessons with this group so you don't make the same mistakes that I've made over the years.
Thank you, Eric. Jeff, you're up. Can you give us a quick overview of your background and your current role?
Sure. Thank you, Eric. Currently, I'm the CROO, which is Chief RevOps Officer at Revcast. There's a longer story, which I won't go into, except to say that I think we're in a very strategic role, and we should kind of have that same level of seniority and colleagueship against the other leaders of the go-to-market functions. I've been doing RevOps, before that sales ops without the title, for nearly 20 years now, 8 different companies that I either was the first person in or was hired to lead an existing team and grow it and scale it and take it to that next level. Marketo, where Eric and I would have been competitors, Intercom, Pendo, some of the notable ones. I had the fortune or misfortune, depending on how you look at it, in the early years of being a team of 1 or 2 and having to learn everything around RevOps, from systems to workflow to process to how to execute forecasting calls and QBRs and enablement. But the one consistent thing that I've always had to spend a lot of my personal time on is the planning function, the modeling function, all of the effort that goes into what you do once you get into the fiscal year, as well as reporting against that and helping with all the replanning that goes on. So excited to be here with both Erics, especially Eric from HubSpot, to, as he said, talk about the battle scars and hopefully help folks avoid some of them and at least think about some of these things as they go forward in their own companies.
Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate it. So why don't we jump directly into talking about revenue plans and why some, or should I say many, revenue plans fail to meet their goals. Can we start with you, Eric?
Yeah, sure. I think there's a long list we could talk in here. I think I'd probably, if I had to pick just a couple, I think for me, there's this kind of you talk about what good looks like. There needs to be, really this concept of sequencing and alignment, not just within the sales organization, but sort of, all the internal orgs that feed into sales. I'm thinking of, product launches. I'm thinking recruiting. I'm thinking financial and budgets. Like, to me, and over my career, that continues to be kind of the common thread in terms of why plans were not successful. We didn't quite have that interlock cross-functionally that's really needed. And, when you don't have that interlock, it's very easy to hit potholes in that you did not expect, or quite frankly, just run out of time, right? And when you're building an annual plan, it's very easy to be optimistic, and particularly with a founder like yourself, Eric, it's easy to be really optimistic about how quickly we can grow. And it's so critical to be grounded and have that interlock between those cross-functional org. Is finance aligned with our growth expectations? Is there budget to support it? Basic things of, do we have enough recruiters in seat to hire the sales reps needed to hit those plans? And so you think about success or failure does come across to not just in that sales org, but the cross-functional dynamics. Are they interlocked and are they aligned to achieving that success? And that's could probably do a whole nother session on that. But to me, that's the biggest driver of issue.
What about you, Jeff? Thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with the ones that Eric mentioned. I agree that there's a long list, and we can probably do an hour or 2 hours just on this. A couple of them that come to mind. One is expanding on what Eric said, is the lack of a planning process and calendar, which does, as he mentioned, integrate all of these functions. It requires you to take a look at recruiting and recruiting resources. Can you actually hire to what you have in there? It requires you to go in the right sequence and order. It requires you to have the right people in the room for reviews of, are you interlocking the demand gen part of the business and the selling part of the business? It demands that you look at your budgets for, say, enablement, if improving the things that come from that are important. And it also provides a decision-making framework. Who makes the decisions at the end of the day to make sure you're aligned? I think the second thing is you sit in a room and you tend to look at spreadsheets and you come up with out of this world assumptions. Let's just increase the win rate by 5% because it's got to be better than where we are. And if we do that, it means that we need less deals, or we're going to get to our goals faster or less costly, but you spend no time putting together how you're actually going to achieve that. So you forget that next layer of the tactics to actually enable the improvements that you might drive in the plan. And the one that's been very frustrating to me are the ones you're showing on this slide, is collecting all of the data required to make those good decisions. Can I even collect an accurate representation of how folks have ramped over the years and make some decisions off of that? And, the tools, we do this in spreadsheets. They get big, they get heavy, they get brittle. They're hard to look at, hard to visualize. So that makes it hard to do assumptions. That makes it hard to show people what the output of those assumptions are. I can go on and on, but those are the three big ones that I think lead to ultimate failure.
Now, Jeff, you mentioned assumptions. In particular, you were talking about just increasing the win rate. So why don't we dig into some of the fundamental assumptions? Eric, let's start with you. Key assumptions that drive plans?
Yeah, sure. We at HubSpot, we think about these assumptions really in three categories: demand, capacity, execution. And so from that demand perspective, you're thinking about marketing qualified leads, you're thinking about BDR meetings generated, you're thinking about inbound partner registrations, those sort of things. Do we have enough of those sort of units of demand in order to justify hiring 10 more sales reps, to justify increasing productivity by 3 points, increasing quota by 3 points, those sort of things? It starts really with demand. And, by incorporating those pieces into your plan, it's also a great way to create accountability, right? You want to have aligned accountability between, in this example, your chief marketing officer is accountable to the business to deliver X units of demand to the sales organization this year. And we're going to measure it according to X terms and conditions. And we're going to measure it and report on it on a monthly, quarterly basis, et cetera. Then you sort of get into the capacity piece of it. Capacity for us is really, it's not just headcount, but it's also tenure mix. And it's also through the lens of how are our ramping new hire reps performing? Do we have the right kind of, metric of humans in seat to be able to respond and react to these demand inputs coming into our business? And then you can move down to execution, where you've got deal creation, close rate, ASP. Those are sort of I would say, isolated into the sales org where they are independently accountable for those. But again, demand, capacity, execution is that framework that we keep coming back to, and quite frankly, go into the actual planning process and are defined as KPIs. And when we talk about strategic upside, we talk about, to use Jeff's example, like we think things are going to get 5% better. We try and correlate those expectations into these KPIs and say, how are we going to make something X% better? Is that realistic? And then you can have the right business conversation around it of who's accountable to do it, what's it going to cost, et cetera.
Jeff, maybe you can add or dig into a little bit or expound upon risks and opportunities that arise from the assumptions.
Yeah, every single one of those variables that Eric mentioned that you plug into a plan that drives some outcome can be a risk or an opportunity, every single one of them, especially as you deviate from the baseline of where your business has been operating. And it's important that you understand the magnitude of those risks. And it's also important that you understand the opportunities. And to give you some examples, we mentioned one earlier. If you're planning on hiring in, say, Q2, more sales reps and SDRs than you've ever hired in the past, like say as many as you hired in the second half of last year, all of last year, but you haven't put into place the recruiting resources or the other infrastructure that's needed in order to do that, you've all of a sudden put a risk in your plan. And if you haven't considered that, you are going to be perpetually behind, because now add to that attrition, which you have to backfill to getting the right amount of butts in seat, but more importantly, getting the right amount of street quota and capacity in street in order to get to your number. So if you plan incorrectly for ramp, for your ability to hire, for any of those KPIs we mentioned before, especially if you're planning on improving them without a plan to actually improve them and measuring the improvement and someone being accountable for that improvement, then you've added tremendous risk in your plan. And when you do that from the beginning, which is what you're doing when you create a plan, it's really hard to dig your way out of that. But on the opportunity side, there's also potential benefits. For example, if you're ramping faster than you thought because you actually did hire a great person to do onboarding and you reconfigured all of it and you've kind of figured out why the best ramp sell faster, you have an opportunity now to either delay hiring by a month or two and save costs, or you have an opportunity to keep hiring on plan and de-risk the plan. So I wouldn't think of these only as terms of risk. You can also think of in terms of opportunity if you exceed some of these things. And lastly, I would say it's important, as I said, to understand the magnitude of the risk. If you raise quota by, say, 10% across everyone, which your finance lead would like you to do, it might result in a reduction of 0 reps that you need in your plan, right? So are you really getting a lot of benefit versus the downside of the morale and attainment and the winning locker room? Or it might result in you reducing your needs by 5 or 6 reps, which is significant. So I think you have to constantly look at the sensitivity for some of the assumptions that you put in and how much risk and relative risk they do have.
Yeah, I like the. Go ahead, Eric.
I was going to jump in there and just, I think there's some great points made there by Jeff. And what I would say to the audience here, folks who've dialed in to hear us speak today are probably in the weeds of planning, right? And I think maybe just a call to action for this group is just, thinking about a lot of this is on this group to be on top of that, to be cross-functionally communicating. I'll go to the example that Jeff gave. If you're going to hire, a world record number of SDRs early in the year, you've got to give recruiting a heads up there, right? If you go to them 90 days out and say, hey, I need, a world record number of SDRs, and they don't have recruiting capacity for it, you're going to be in deep trouble. You've got to give them multiple periods of months notice. Just think about it from their perspective. They have to go find recruiters, get those recruiters enabled and in seat before those recruiters can actually even go execute on the hiring plan that you've built, right? So just a call to action to this group to always be thinking about what other cross-functional groups need to be involved and aligned to this plan. They're not a recruiting team very frequently is coming to me saying what's going to happen 6-9 months. It's very much on my team and us to push awareness out to them of anything that is sort of abnormal, just to Jeff's example there. Sorry,
Yeah.
just want to chime
No,
in a
I
bit.
think that was a great ad, and I think those changes, right, require a sense of agility too. Like as hiring plans change, as targets change, you know, as attrition is higher or ramps are slower or whatever happens to affect you know, the plan, having the agility to adapt is extremely important. And I know we have one of our final, you know, questions will be covering, you know, agility in the process and how we make revenue operations think through this idea of continuous agile planning. So let's keep jumping into fundamental assumptions. Specifically, let's talk about ramp. What are the key assumptions? Or Jeff, let's start with you. Can you talk to us about ramp and ramp assumptions that impact the likelihood of your plan success, and what are the key things you need to think about there?
Yeah, it's one of the key things. And I mentioned an example earlier. You know, there's opportunity there, not just risk. If you don't have a honest, I'll use that word, representation of what the real ramp is, you again are going to get yourself in a deficit of real, and by real I mean quality, as opposed to what's in a spreadsheet, street capacity and quota capacity on the street. In other words, the reps that are ramping, and even after they're done with their ramp, are still not going to deliver the amount that you need them to deliver in order to get to your number, even though the spreadsheet says it does. So, you know, we mentioned earlier that you have to understand the drivers of these assumptions and go through the analysis. And there's really three things that are important when you're thinking about ramp. One is the length of the ramp. Is it 3 months or is it 6 months? And 1 month, one way or the other way, can make a difference in terms of getting that capacity on there, because it impacts when you have to work backwards and hire and have that button seat, which also impacts, as we mentioned a couple of times, what recruiting has to do and what others have to do in order to make that happen. So the length of time is important, and it varies by segment. It varies by where you are in a company. It varies by how well of a profile you define for the reps that you're hiring. You know, if you make better hires that are aligned to what skills they need for the segment or the role, they're going to ramp faster. And obviously your investment in enablement. If you're not investing in onboarding and enablement, you're not really going to improve this. The shape of the ramp is just as important. You know, a ramp could be 0, 0, 25, 50, 75, 100, or it could be 25, 25, 75, 75, and 100. Same amount of time, but how you get there is different. And although this doesn't have as big of an impact on timing, still knowing this and being overly aggressive is also going to put you in a deficit or give you a wrong sense of how well you're building up that quality and that real capacity to deliver deals. So you have to look at both of these, and you have to constantly look at both of these. The third thing I'll mention is, what is fully ramped mean, right? Does it mean the amount of time it takes for a rep to get to their quota? Well, it probably doesn't, because you're putting in assumptions in terms of average attainment. So if your average attainment in your plan is 80%, your attainment factor, is it the length of time it takes that rep to get to 80% of their quota? Well, what if your sales team is only delivering at 70% attainment to quota? Should your expectation of a fully ramped rep be the amount of time it takes them to get to where your existing quote unquote fully ramped reps are? Probably that last one is where it should be, or somewhere in the middle of the second to last one. So if you set that fully ramped target incorrectly as full quota or attainment, or don't consider where your current reps are performing, you're also going to be off on this assumption and add risk to your plan, and increase the likelihood of you being off, especially if you're doing a lot of hiring. So all of these things matter. You should consider all of them as you're implementing your ramp. And as you said before, you used the word agility, Eric. Your ramps can shift and change over the course of the year. And set aside what you do in a comp plan, because a comp plan is a little bit of financial engineering. If the real world ramp is 10 months, you don't necessarily want to give them 10 months of a ramped quota. But at least in your planning and your forecasting, you should have an understanding that it's not the 6 months we have in the plan, that it's the 10 months. And you should constantly monitor that. And it's okay to give reps that are hired in the second half of the year a shorter ramp if your ramps are improving and you implement it, you know, new tactics in order to do that. So that also should be a variable or a flexible point when you're thinking about the agility of how to get to your number over the course of the year.
Eric, can you give us some ideas on best practices for modeling ramp?
Yeah, sure. I guess what I'd say, maybe just to jump in, is I think this is the most misunderstood and miscommunicated metric, across different orgs. And I've had real example conversations with our CEO that she's talked to another company, and their reps are ramping twice as fast as we are under a completely different definition of what ramp is. And so I think there's a lot of just noise in the industry here on how one company measures ramp versus another company here. And there's a lot that goes into that. Maybe just a couple other points that are pertainable to my experiences that Jeff didn't mention. Like, are you giving your new hire reps a book of customers to start, or are they going into a brand new territory and starting cold with no inbound demand, and they got to go create all of their own pipeline from scratch? Like, that rep is going to have a much longer ramp time than somebody else who's coming into a warm territory. Particularly in small and growing companies, that dynamic is so critical to understand and be fair, right? I think you also need to be very mindful of, the cost to the business of having somebody hire in an external rep, start, go through that ramp process 7, 8, 9 months into their time at the company. If they're not confident that they can hit quota, they're going to leave around month 12. And that is the most expensive hire that you can make as a company, an unsuccessful rep who didn't make it to that 12-month mark, right? So I think there's something to be said with, setting your external hires up for success and making sure that they're believers in the company. They're believers that they can be successful and hit quota here. And that's hard for maybe your CFO or maybe someone else in your org cross-functionally giving you a hard time about jamming this group with quota, right? It is infinitely more expensive to have that person leave the company at month 10 to 12 than it otherwise would have been to get them successful and invest in those enablement functions early on, right? We're not really making money on the company's not making money on these reps until they hit maturity, right? That's the reality of this stuff. So I think keeping that in mind is super critical. And, I guess if you were looking to me for some best practices, I just got to raise my hand and say that I've messed this up numerous times at numerous companies. I've given pitches to private equity investors based on our ramp that I'm looking back now years later, like, what was I doing? This was wrong. And it's a really, really hard thing to get right. I guess what I would say to the audience here is, balancing the efforts of your recruiting team to get somebody in seat with bringing enablement resources in. How are you investing there? Getting these external hires to be successful by month 12. What does it take? And if you're having a high degree of failure, a high percentage of failure at month 6, 7, you got to root cause that and understand that. From a planning perspective, you have to also be honest with yourselves and be honest with your leaders. As you go and hire people, that means more dollars in your plan. It means more quota in the plan. But all of that is delaying pain and delaying the inevitable if these reps are not going to be successful. So maybe I just scared everybody here, Eric, and I apologize.
I hope you didn't scare everybody. I think they knew what they signed up for. Yeah. Jeff, you have a quick example from work you did at Revcast. Can you tell us the story?
Yeah, but before I go in there, I just want to reinforce something that Eric said, and it's probably the third time we're mentioning it. Just because you designate your ramp time to be 4 months or 6 months or something else, your measurement of reps getting closer and closer to their quota should never end. As Eric said, they often don't get to that steady state, consistent performance until they're tenured, 12 months, 18 months, and figuring out how they get there and figure out how to compress that time, even if it's technically outside of that time that you plan or you're compensating for ramp, is incredibly important. And capturing, as Eric mentioned, all of the factors involved, not just enablement, but pipeline, territory, manager, and all of those things too. So sorry, Eric, for knocking you off, but the example
Yeah, no problem. I mean, I think I pulled up a visual here that I had handy too. Just I think it is important what you were just talking about. Can you visualize what your ramp looks like by segment, by team? Are you getting those insights? Are you getting that information? Because then you can use that to adjust. It might be a manager that needs more training because his group in commercial, is ramping a lot slower than, his peers. I think what you said makes a lot of sense. But
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see from
jump to
that
the
chart.
example.
Okay, well, we'll go back to the chart after this. I wanted to share this example. It's actually an example of an opportunity, not a risk. And I think it's important because we often talk about risk and the downside to share this. We were working with a customer that did not do a good job of tracking ramp or keeping all of their data in a single place or even understanding it. So part of it was helping to educate them how to think about this. And what we discovered is that their actual ramp to get to the performance of where their other existing reps was a couple much shorter than what they had planned for. And what this meant is they did two things. One is they hired earlier than they should have. Number two is that they gave them a longer ramped quota than they should have. And this results in increased costs. You're on payroll for a little bit longer than you need to be, and you're also getting higher rates on whatever you close in that ramped period than you should be as well. So with this knowledge, what they did is not just adjust the dates of hire and adjust the comp plans, but they understood how much cost it was saving, and it was saving about the equivalent of 1.5 equivalent sales reps in terms of cost. They had a strategic objective to move up market and to start building an enterprise segment. They were not able to do that for some financial considerations until much later in the year. But because they realized this early, right when they were in their planning process, they were able to free up the cash and they were able to hire an enterprise rep a lot earlier in the year and actually add growth to the number. So this is a great example that if you understand your performance, better formulate your assumptions, that you can actually not only improve the bottom line, your efficiencies, but you can also grow the top line if you do this early and soon enough. And I think this is a great example of spending the time to do all of this when you're in your planning and in the beginning of the year to understand where you are. And this is a great win-win. And they were able to do that cost neutral. So not only were they able to save costs, but they were able to grow the revenue and do it in a way that actually increased efficiency.
Awesome, thanks. Eric, it looked like you wanted to jump in and say something there.
I was actually just coughing, sorry.
No, that's all good. That's all good. Hey, we're gonna jump forward a little bit. We're gonna skip through this chart. I know we covered it really quickly, but the idea of getting, making sure you're tracking how you're doing actuals versus plan, I think is very important. However you track that information, spreadsheets, Looker, custom software like Revcast, it's an important thing to make sure you're tracking. But we got a lot to cover today, so I wanted to jump on to hiring and attrition. And there are really two key assumptions that go hand in hand. Eric, do you want to kick us off? Maybe you'll start talking to us about the important things to think about when you're building and managing your hiring plan.
Sure. I think I think this is applicable to companies of all sizes, but maybe how we primarily think about at HubSpot. I think I have this expression of like, we want to grow responsibly. And there's a responsibility that I feel and have always felt toward those hires that we are bringing into the org. Do we have enough demand for them to be successful? Are we putting these hires in a spot where they can achieve quota? And there comes a point where we cannot hire sort of responsibly anymore, and we evaluate that on a year-long basis. And we're quite frankly also pushing marketing, pushing our demand gen functions to say, we want to add more heads. Do you have enough demand? Do you have enough leads? Do you have enough meetings, et cetera, in order for us to do this? And I think we've shifted, really ironically. Earlier in my career, you talk to a sales leader and they're like, I want to hire 500 people. I want to hire so many people. And I think over the last 2 years, I've seen a real shift, at least, with some of my peers and also here at HubSpot, where sales leaders are much more apprehensive about hiring in some of the demand constrained environment that, a lot of SaaS companies have moved into following sort of the great old days of COVID, if you want to call it that were immense tailwinds for many digital solutions, SaaS products that, we experienced a lot of very excessive growth in those periods, and that sort of organic demand is slowed down post COVID. I don't think I'm saying anything that's not news to folks here, but it's I would say the willingness to hire is really changed. And I think the sales leaders know that we should only be hiring up to the point where we feel comfortable where reps can be successful. And that's, like I said, demand management, anticipating where demand is, territory optimization, number of customers that we can give to new hire reps in order for them to have some easy wins to go sell to, some friendly faces to go sell to as they're ramping in here.
Jeff, you want to jump in and add some perspective on attrition in particular?
Yeah, I do. Since we started Revcast and I've been here for the last 2+ years, I've talked to dozens, if not hundreds of folks and looked at many plans. And the majority of them do not even consider attrition. And by not considering attrition, you are not going to get your hiring plan right, and you're not going to get any of the things around actually making those hires right, because you're going to have to add all of them, and you're going to lose street quota, and you're not going to get out of it. Or if they have attrition assumptions in planning, they use technically the right formula that says your attrition rate is X% a month, but you're never going to be in a state where you're losing 2 reps a month or 5 reps a month. That you have to look at your attrition by month, and it's typically seasonal in sales. For example, end of the year, they get their last paycheck for the year. You usually have a little bit more attrition than you do in, say, the second or third month of a new fiscal year. You have to consider this when you create your hiring plan for the year after, and you have to add the backfills in there. And ideally, you're adding them in there a couple months or a ramp time length before you anticipate that attrition. You can always pin that headcount if you don't have the attrition, and you just are hiring a little bit forward of, say, a later headcount, which doesn't cost you a ton, but it's better than losing street quota. So not hiring attrition is a singular way in which your plan will fail, and not considering it will lead you to that failure. And I also want to mention that there's 2 types of attrition. One is people leaving the company, either voluntary or involuntary. The other is promotions. Small business reps become mid-market reps. Mid-market reps become managers or become enterprise reps, etc. And this is managed attrition, and it should not be random. At Intercom, we put in a process where there are only certain times during the year when promotions from one segment to other would start. Therefore, you knew when that was going to happen. We generally knew if you had 4 roles to fill, that 2 would come internal and 2 would come external. And that would allow us to manage the backfilling of it. So we wouldn't put the small business team at a deficit and make it harder for them to get to their number because the mid-market team was randomly pulling somebody every time they needed to fill a spot. I mean, if you do this, if you publish it and you work against it, you're at least significantly reducing the risk of the attrition that happens for a good reason, internal promotions, and try to consider that when you're planning or when you're executing your plan as well.
Eric, you wanted to add some thoughts?
Yeah, just one thing. If I could go back 15 years in my career, I think what Jeff said, I would have loved that advice 15 years ago. I'll quote myself 15 years ago developing a sales plan, and it would have been, yeah, we've got 125% quota coverage at the street, and we're going to use that extra 25% buffer to mitigate against attrition. That is a very lazy way to plan, right? And I think, Jeff, I'm guilty of what you're sharing here, where forecasting and getting this right is really hard. So early in my career, you made the mistake of just assigning quite the large buffer of quota out in your plan and expecting that to bleed down as the year progressed. I would encourage everyone here on the call to be a little bit more detail oriented than I was 15 years ago. Plan for that attrition. loop recruiting into that attrition schedule that you have so they know when to be expecting to hire folks and do a better job than I did 15 years ago.
Yeah, I learned it from making the same mistakes, Eric.
There we
I
go.
think we probably all did.
Yeah.
Let's shift and talk a little bit about pipeline capacity. Jeff, your quick thoughts on pipeline capacity and how revenue organizations should think about it?
Yeah, real quick is we've mentioned it a little bit, but you also often think of capacity in terms of sales reps. What's their quota and their capacity to close deals. Eric mentioned this in his opening when we talked about ramp, your ability to generate the pipeline that the sales reps need in order to deliver it is just as important. And this is how much pipeline do reps have to deliver. Most companies say they should deliver some. Most companies don't set a target or don't measure against it. It has to do with the different types of BDRs you may have. How much pipeline can they deliver? It also has to do with organization, say partner organization, which is supposed to be delivering leads directly to the AEs. You have to understand and consider their capacity to deliver, as well as any direct capacity that doesn't flow through SDRs from marketing or referrals or from some other teams. So if you don't do this part of the equation, you're going to overhire, the reps are going to be starving, or you're going to continue to hire when they don't have enough capacity, or it works the other way around. If you're actually generating too much, you don't have reps to handle good quality leads, you're in a situation that also isn't as good. So we talked about linking these and integrating these across teams and the go-to-market supply chain. Pipeline capacity is just as critical as sales rep and quota capacity.
Eric, what would you add?
I think that's really well said. What I would just maybe contribute here is, and HubSpot has really taught me this. If anyone's familiar with HubSpot, we are very SMB in orientation in terms of our target customer that we sell to. Therefore, we have very fast sales cycles. And so we have an element of our pipeline that exists on day one of a fiscal period, but we create and close a very large percentage of our business sort of within that sort of fiscal period that we're talking about here. So I would encourage folks to understand that dynamic, encourage and say, all right, on day one, I'm going to make up numbers. I have $100 of pipeline on a sales target of 30. But I know that I'm going to, go find $10 of new pipeline that's going to create and close in period that I don't even see yet in terms of a deal record in my CRM. So I'm just understanding that long cycle pipeline dynamic versus the short cycle, I think is so critical, especially if folks on the call here have inside sales teams that may have faster sales cycles. For field-based enterprise sales teams, it's probably okay to ignore that. But if you've got high velocity inside sales teams, understand that dynamic of create and close in period. We call it short cycle here. I think it's a good name for it. And it helps us understand our dynamics of pipeline progression throughout the period.
That was awesome. Awesome.
Second that.
Let's jump into quote on the street and attainment. We left an era of growth at all costs, right? It seemed like companies grew a ton of quota on the street, and there wasn't a lot of thought given to how to feed them pipeline, and probably, frankly, less thought given to attainment cost and those petty efficiency metrics. Jeff, let's start with you. How should we think about quota on the street in today's environment or today's world where, frankly, money isn't free?
Yeah, it's the old adage of mother bear, you need just the right amount, at the right time, at the right place.
Goldilocks, I guess.
Goldilocks. It's so important that you plan for this in the right way, and we've talked about that a lot. But it's also so important that you stay on top of this. Do you have enough capacity to get to your goals? But the attainment needed is the one that tends to fluctuate. If your attainment is going down, your actual attainment over the course of the year, then you might want to pause or delay some hiring and figure out how to get that back up because you have unused capacity. Don't add the cost, figure out how to get reps producing more. And if you start to see that your attainment to quota is going up, especially above where you plan, then it's a good signal in order to add and think about adding more street quota. And maybe even you're pulling ahead some of the things in the plan to do this. So the amount of attainment that you put into your plan, and I did put together a blog post, I think about a year ago, with a table on the different amounts and how much overassign or underassign or risk and even cost that it creates. The more or the lower that you put that attainment factor needed in your plan to de-risk the plan, say we're going to plan at 60%, the more costly and inefficient that plan is. If you make it too high at 85 or 90%, you're quickly going to lose that through attrition or like hiring or something else going on, and you're going to put yourself in that deficit. So you have to almost create a grid of the different levels and see how much reserve capacity you have relative to how well your reps are producing, and determine that right place within that grid of the risk reward. Are you going to be more aggressive? Are you going to err on the side of capturing more growth at the expense of productivity or efficiency? Or do you really want to optimize towards that efficiency and you're going to be a little more conservative? Those two things work in tandem all year, and you need to think of them far beyond planning, and you need to constantly monitor them throughout the year, and constantly get to that right and make those decisions as to what that right balance is between these two.
Eric?
Yeah, just
I'm
yeah,
sure
maybe
you have... Oh,
a,
go ahead.
a small chime in here. I think we've actually gone to reporting rep attainment as sort of a separate metric side by side to how the company's performing. And we're looking at rep attainment through the kind of the tenured lens of, hey, our ramping reps are performing here, our mid-tenured reps are performing this way, and our tenured reps are performing this way. And we're looking for those pockets there. And I guess what I would say is I would challenge folks here to not be bound by your company plan and company target. We've made some very intentional decisions to either accelerate quota assignment or quota growth. And we've also made some conscious decisions to decelerate it or not assign a quota increase when we had planned to. Just going back to that thought that I had here of being equitable with our reps and coming back to first principles to say, we want X number of folks to be above quota, and we want average attainment to be Y% of goal. I think I would encourage folks who are on the call here to RepView is a company that's a great follow, and they publish a lot of data on average attainment and percentage of reps at goal for almost every tech company that has a sales org out there. I would study their data and figure out what works for you culturally at your company, and keep coming and orient back to that as first principles. As you think about it, is when you ask yourself the question, is rep attainment healthy or not? I think those should be first principles that you agree on at the start of the year for the teams.
I think those are great points. I'm going to jump forward just for time reasons, and let's talk a little bit about, touch on briefly execution. And it also allows me to quote Mike Tyson. So Eric, everybody has a plan until they're punched in the mouth, as Mike would say. What do you do in reality as different plans for your revenue organization?
Yeah. So just to maybe set the scene for what I'm about to share here, I'll take HubSpot, for example, but I think we were definitely not alone in this, with this massive digital acceleration pull during that period of COVID. And then the dreaded word of macro has really kind of slowed things down kind of post that COVID period here. And we've been asking ourselves here at HubSpot, are we hiring? Are we growing fast enough? And that's shifted to say, are we growing responsibly here? And so we've adopted this program called Agile planning, where we're constantly, I would say, reevaluating our plan. And that's done actually on a monthly basis. And we're looking at various KPIs here. I can show you the scorecard that we use in a second. And we're asking ourselves, are we hiring enough, or are we hiring not fast enough and we need to put more people in seat, right? Because our plan is locked usually by January 4th, and we may feel entirely differently by March or April. And we need to be conscious and understanding that we're not going to get it all right in January. We're just not going to do that. And we need to build a process that allows us to adapt. It may mean, in an example, hiring less corporate reps and hiring more small business reps instead, because we're getting a demand shift towards small business. It may mean hiring less reps in EMEA, more in JPAC, for example. It may not necessarily mean adjusting the whole plan, but how you get there, the small Lego pieces of the plan, we're constantly tinkering with that throughout the year. And if you can flip to the next slide, Eric, I'll just show my kind of a sample of the scorecard that we use for the team. These are we look at a little bit longer list, but just for the sake of this audience here, we're looking at through that lens of demand, capacity, execution, things from rep headcount down to close rate and ASP. These are the big 6 things that we're looking at and saying, and you'll notice I've got some fake stoplights in here, red, yellow, green. Are we yellow or green on these metrics? If we are, we can continue hiring. If we've got a couple reds, let's talk about them. Let's talk about what we need to do to fix them and ask ourselves, should we slow hiring in certain parts of the business until we can kind of resume the concept of, hiring responsibly and making sure our reps are set up. So that is something, it's a lot of work. Planning is already a lot of work as it is, but this is something that we do really in the first, I'd say Q1 and Q2, just to make sure that the plan is as calibrated as possible for us.
Thanks, Eric. Now, just a reminder, if you have questions, get them in. I've answered a couple in line. The company, just for everyone that Eric had mentioned about a quota attainment, was RepView. Software, someone was talking to me about software. Revcast, we do provide software to help manage the creation, execution of plans and how you build and create and track to the success of your revenue organization. With that, I'm going to jump back here just real quick, Jeff, so you can grab your thoughts on execution too, and then we'll jump into questions.
Yeah, I think, Eric and I have a perfect mind meld on this. Being agile and the way that he described it and showed you on his scorecard exactly how everybody should be doing this. And it is difficult and challenging to do, but there's many ways to get to your number. And what Eric did not suggest, just to be perfectly clear, is that you adjust your number. You're just thinking about the different ways that you could potentially get there. Just because your plan says hire 5 mid-market reps, if that segment's underperforming and your enterprise segment is overperforming, you might want to shift some of those resources to enterprise and still get to your number. And it's not just measuring, the key elements in the plan, and even though you have high-level ones, but it's having a mechanism and infrastructure to measure the drivers of those. What's the recruiting velocity? Are all of my reps in seat late because they don't have enough recruiters or I don't have them prioritized enough? So it's understanding the drivers of those things when they start to go yellow and when they start to go red. But most importantly, having a framework that Eric showed of order to say, okay, everything's good in green. So let's think about actually getting ourselves beyond the number, or we're starting to signal some things that we need to dig into. We might not have all the answers now, but at least we know where to look. And we can come back with some insights and some recommendations. Is exactly what you should be doing. Ideally, if you have a team or the infrastructure looking at this every month. At Marketo, we had something called Metrics Monday, the third Monday of every month. We put together a scorecard like this. It's a massive, massive amount of effort because it was all spreadsheet based. But this is very, very important. Planning doesn't end just because the year starts. Executing to the plan, adjusting the plan then begins.
Yeah, and with that, I fast-fingered to the slide a little bit earlier than I wanted to, but Eric talked about this. I'm a recovering engineer, so I love the idea of moving from lengthy long-term planning processes to quick agile revenue organizations, right? It feels a lot like engineering has changed too. I know, Eric, you talked about this slide, and this approach and this idea of agile, but Jeff, what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, as I mentioned, it's exactly what you should do. Just because your plan says you have to do something doesn't mean you have to do something. And the earlier that you can consider how we're performing and project where you're going to perform and bring those insights, and within the RevOps team, I think our role is to provide suggestions, but also being able to get the people that ultimately have to deliver into the right conversations being data driven, then you can start making those adjustments. Again, it's not about changing your number. It's just about the different pathways to get there or readjusting priorities. Maybe our priority needs to be competitive win rates. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe next quarter it needs to shift to velocity. Or maybe the quarter after it needs to shift to better understanding our create and close, as Eric mentioned, within their business. So being agile and constantly assessing this I think it gets you out of firefighting, but it gets you to be data driven in terms of where to focus and where there's risk and where there's also opportunity.
Yeah, and then lastly, just to jump in there, I would say it also creates a really organic accountability across functionally, right? If our BDR org, for example, is not performing, boom, it's calling it out. If we're not getting enough leads from marketing, boom, it's called out. If recruiting's not hiring fast enough, boom, it's called out. So it's great at identifying potholes before they become giant. I'm from Boston, giant Boston-sized potholes. You need little potholes, we can fix them, but once they get big, they only get bigger.
Yeah, agree.
So, it's time now. I know we've, depending on whether it was ending at 2:45 Eastern or 3 o'clock Eastern, we're either have a few more minutes for questions or we're over. But we do have a few questions that have come in. I'll organize them. I'll remind people if they haven't read the the big book of great Revcasting. Well, that's hard to say sometimes. Preventing Revenue Plan Failure. You can check it out at revcast.com. Click on the resources tab. I think, personally, I find it very insightful. Jumping into questions. How often should people check in on assumptions? You showed that dashboard, Eric, what's a cadence? How often should they dig in deep? And it seems like a lot of work without the tools to support it.
Yeah, you got to have the tools for sure. And I think that's where Revcast comes in and can really help a lot of the folks on the call here today. It depends on how your operating rhythm of your company works. Are you running monthly business reviews, quarterly business reviews? I've done monthly and quarterly in my career at HubSpot. We run the business monthly. I think that's a better way to do things. However, it is a ton of work. So if you are an ops team that is constrained from a resource perspective, which I would imagine 95% of them are, quarterly may be a better approach. But I'd also push back on you a little bit and urge you to do monthly and say, if it's April 1st, is it already too late to adjust? I think our process of looking at it at the monthly level allows us to adjust intra-quarter. Particularly, you can use forecasts and say, like, if our demand forecast is not there, if our bookings forecast is not there, you can make adjustments mid-quarter, and the sooner you adjust, the sooner you can course correct. So I would say if you can do it monthly, if not, quarterly is better than nothing.
Do we have weekly?
Well, I think to add to that, I think monthly is a great cadence, but I think different one of those measures are better suited for weekly versus monthly. And some you might want to do rolling averages because of the fluctuation by week or month. For example, you should be looking as part of your weekly forecast call how you're doing on hiring.
Yeah, I think that's a good.
You don't need to wait for once a month for that. Win rates, maybe it's okay to wait once a month.
Yeah, I do know at Pendo,
we did that every week.
In the early days, our early misses were all just about not having enough people in seed in the right spots, just because of the scale of growth, even before zero interest rate. Which leads us to a question that ironically came from another Eric. What does a post zero interest rate chief revenue officer look like? Are they different? Do they have different skills? Is the world for CROs or VPs of sales changed?
I mean, I'll try to give my answer, and I think there's a lot of ways to answer this. Every sales leader I've interviewed before or after that has always told me how data driven they are, and the vast majority are not. Now I think they have to be. Right. And I think it's real easy to suss out the ones that are not, real easy to suss out the ones that are just, let me hire. I don't have enough people, and that's the reason why I'm not delivering. So I do think that they have to be more data and insights driven. They should absolutely rely on the RevOps team in order to help get them there. And they have to be more aware of the other functions within go-to-market that impact their business or what they impact as well, whether it's demand gen. They just can't point to marketing anymore and say, give us more. They have to understand their responsibility and accountability in that. And they have to pay more attention to their efficiency ratios.
Yeah, super well said. I think just to maybe give an example, not to relate it back to me and my job today, but our CEO has been on that career track of an ops professional. Director of ops at Workday, VP of ops at Workday, VP of ops at Dropbox, chief customer officer at Dropbox, chief customer officer at HubSpot, into CEO at HubSpot. And so someone who has grown up through that ops tract into leading sales organizations, into leading marketing organizations, into being a CEO eventually. I think if you're not data driven, you're not going to be a sales leader going forward. For me, it's pretty black and white.
Either that, or I guess they have to have you guys over for dinner every night, right? You know, be hand in hand with the people with the strong operational backgrounds. With that, I think we're at time. Wanted to thank everyone for who's on with us for attending. Invite people to connect with Eric or Jeff on LinkedIn. You can find them there. And again, thanks, Eric. This was wonderful. Thanks, Jeff. I greatly enjoyed hosting.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Eric and Eric. Thanks, everyone.